what I'm going to talk about relatively briefly is the issue of herding. The first thing to be clear on is exactly what we mean by herding. And actually, while we were doing the inquiry, the American Association for Political Opinion Research published a report that had a sort of definition, which we think is a reasonable definition. And their definition is, herding specifically refers to the possibility that pollsters use existing poll results to help adjust the presentation of their own poll results. Herding strategies can range from making statistical adjustments to ensure that the released results appear similar to existing polls, to deciding whether or not to release the poll depending on how the results compare to existing polls. So this is a reasonable definition, and this is a thing that people talked about in the wake of the election, specifically with reference to the fact that the final polls were so similar, that almost all of them were plus or minus 1 point, with one exception, which was 2 points. There was a sense, I think, that many people had that this conveyed a consensus, perhaps a false consensus, and that this might be the result of these kinds of phenomena. One thing we want to emphasize is that herding can arise, and indeed does arise because pollsters are trying to be accurate. This can arise consciously, it can also arise unconsciously, as pollsters look at their data, look at their analysis, and try to make sense of whether their weighting procedures are working as expected. One of the ways that you might conclude that something had gone wrong with your weighting procedure is if the result you get out is very much out of line with what your own polls have shown previously or what other pollsters have shown. So we're going to focus today on the conservative labor difference because that's really been the focus of sort of most of the attention on the result. It's the headline result. It's the most electorally important result. And as we've seen, it's largely what pollsters are being judged on. The tricky thing about assessing whether there was herding is figuring out what the appropriate benchmark is. So the question we want to ask is, did the reported conservative labor differences across pollsters vary less than they ought to have varied in the final polls? They seem not to have varied very much, but the question is, what is the right benchmark? How much should they have varied? And part of the reason this is tricky is because the sample sizes of those final polls were much higher than all of the preceding polls. Most of the pollsters increased their sample sizes in the final round of polls for the very reasonable, to achieve the reasonable goal of having the most accurate final poll that they could produce. So they were trying to drive down sampling variability. So the question then is, did they, if we account for that increase in sample size, was the variation still lower than it ought to have been? And that's the difficult part in the analysis. So what we've done is we've compared the level of variation in the final polls to 3 different benchmarks. One of these is the polls at earlier times in the short campaign. And again, when we've done this, we've adjusted for the sample size. So the comparison we're making takes into account the fact that these final polls are larger on average. The other 2 benchmarks are theoretical benchmarks. One of them is a benchmark of the reported sample sizes if these were simple random samples. Simple random samples are a nice, easy theoretical benchmark. However, we also don't think they're quite the right benchmark. So the other benchmark that we've used is treating the polls as stratified samples, which is not exactly right, but we think it's the closest theoretically tractable benchmark for how a quota poll should behave. So this plot here has a number of things going on, and I'm going to go through them in turn. So the y-axis is an estimate of the variance across pollsters, how much the polling results were varying across the x-axis, which is the short campaign. And our estimates are the solid black curve, and as you can see, there's a substantial degree of uncertainty in this trend. The dotted line, the highest horizontal line there, is the simple random sample benchmark. If the pollsters had been doing simple random samples, we would have expected to see this much variability, again, once we've done our sample size adjustment. As you can see, the amount of variability is lower than that, However, it's very close early in the campaign to the stratified sample benchmark that we constructed. The reason that we would expect stratified samples to have lower variability than simple random samples in this case is, as Yoni explained earlier, one of the variables that's used by almost all pollsters in some way is a sort of political affinity, past vote, party identification of some kind, which is a very powerful predictor of vote intention. And so when you use that to correct for the sort of the random variation in the sample that you've drawn with respect to that variable, it tends to reduce variability in the final published results. So that's why that line is lower. And you'll notice that it's actually very, very close to what we observe in terms of variability across pollsters in the first part of the early campaign. What we think is striking is there is this downward curve at the end. So it does seem that there's evidence that the variance across pollsters was lower even after we account for the sample size increases at the end of the campaign than it was at the beginning. So then the question is, why might this have happened? So we know that pollsters changed certain elements of their weighting methods as the election approached. And this is a standard thing that they've done in past elections as well. Part of it has to do with the possibility that people will answer questions in different ways, that you might want to weight in different ways. And so what we've done is reanalyze the pollsters' final polls using the weighting approach that they followed in their earlier polls. This is leveraging the fact that we have their microdata and their weighting procedures. And so the question we're asking with this analysis is, did the changes that pollsters made as the election approached have the effect of reducing the observed variation across them? So this picture is a little hard to interpret. It's in the same style as the ones you've seen before. On the left, we have what we're calling the original weighting, which is slightly confusing. This is the final polls as published using the weighting that was used. And then on the right, we have what would have happened had those pollsters weighted in exactly the same way they did early in the campaign. Now, for some pollsters, there's no difference, and so they're completely flat. They used exactly the same weighting procedure early and late. Some pollsters changed their weighting. And so there are a bunch of horizontal lines for changes in weighting that either didn't make any difference or where there was no change in weighting. You see about 4 of the pollsters where, had they used the early campaign weighting, they would have had a result that was actually around a 2-point labor lead instead of a result that's around a tied election. So there are 2 things that are interesting about this. So when you calculate the variances, there is a small change in the variance. It's not enormous. It's, of course, very sensitive to exactly the pollsters in this analysis because there aren't very many of them. But what you see most immediately is that these changes in weighting helped the results. They pushed the results towards the actual result of the election, not nearly far enough, but these were changes in weighting that improved the accuracy of the polls while also perhaps clustering them a bit around 0. So the second thing that we've done is reanalyze the final polls using a common weighting approach. So the pollsters each have their own weighting, as has been described already. They're different approaches, but there's a common structure. And so one of the things we've done is taken a common approach, weighting to the same targets, doing the same turnout modeling, and applied that to all of the raw data from the final polls to see whether that changes the variability in the polling results. And here we see a clearer difference, which is when we use this standardized weighting on the raw data, we see a much larger amount of variation in the final polls. So the different weighting procedures that the pollsters used did have this effect of narrowing the variability in what they reported versus had they all used exactly the same procedure for doing their post-sampling weighting and turnout modeling. So just to summarize this, we find evidence that there was less variation in the conservative labor lead across pollsters at the end of the campaign than early in the campaign. It's a large substantive effect. There aren't very many pollsters, so it's a sort of statistically, for those of you concerned about statistical significance, it's marginal because there are not that many pollsters. And so this is the sort of downward turn that might happen by chance. We can't rule it out just from the particular polls that happen to be reported near the end of the campaign. If the pollsters had analyzed the raw data from the final polls in the ways they analyzed their earlier polls, they would have reported only slightly more variable results, but also generally worse results on the conservative labor lead. So the changes they made improved things and perhaps compressed the variation a little bit. However, if the pollsters had all analyzed the raw data in exactly the same way as one another, that would have led to more variable results. Although you'll note, again, this isn't really speaking to the fact that all of those numbers were too low. It's merely speaking to the amount of variation. So the final thing I want to say is that none of this implies malpractice, and nor does it imply that all pollsters were herding. We think it's suggestive that some were, and again, herding here can mean looking back to their own previous polls, looking to other polls. It can be conscious, it can be unconscious. And we do think that herding is, ultimately about pollsters trying to get the right vote distribution, regardless of which of those mechanisms it is. And finally, we don't see any real evidence that this is responsible for the fact that the polls were off the mark on average. It simply doesn't look like that part of the story. We view it as something that's important to address as we think about going forward and trying to make clearer the independence and the informational content of the polls. So I'm going to hand this back to you.
Okay, so thanks very much, Ben. And I'm just going to conclude here with a reference to Lenin, as Patton reminded me earlier. What is to be done? And this is really just by way of saying that we aren't, I'm not going to here give a list of detailed recommendations. We will have detailed recommendations in the report in March. But what I will say is generally where our recommendations are going to focus is we will be sort of making some recommendations for how pollsters can make changes, as Yoni put it, within the current paradigm. There are things that can be done, but in all likelihood the pollsters are probably looking at those already. In fact, we know they are. We're happy to chip in with our own suggestions for how that can be done. We are not, as some rumours have had it, going to be recommending that all polls should move to random probability designs here. I mean, we, clearly, I'm a social statistician from the University of Southampton, so I kind of believe in random probability designs. But I don't think that it's horses for courses, and I'm yet to be convinced that that sort of approach can be realistically applied in a straightforward way into the polling context. We've also tried to avoid implying that random probability samples are always right. I mean, we focused on the lead. That's the important thing, but they weren't as accurate. I mean, forgetting confidence intervals for now, but they weren't as accurate on the small parties, and they indeed overestimated Labour and Conservatives. So, random probability do not guarantee you to get it right. That isn't to say we wouldn't welcome some innovation, some move towards thinking about how random could be more used in this context. We think there could be certainly a case made for something which would serve as a beacon or a calibration, while not being the only way of doing polls. It might be part of the mix. We'll also be thinking about the current BPC regulations in terms of the transparency and reporting of procedures and adjustments and so on, and that speaks, I think, mainly to the herding issue, which, as we've seen, it's difficult. We're never really going to be in a situation where you say this was definitely herding. There just aren't enough pollsters, even with the very large number of polls that we have now. But it would definitely be useful, again, thinking forward to the 2035 polling inquiry, to have regulations in place that would enable the chairperson then to say this can't have happened because we've got these procedures in place which mean that we can largely rule it out. And, of course, another thing that we'll be looking at, and we were tasked with in our terms of reference, were how we interpret and report on polls. I thought that there was a very sort of reflective piece by Andrew Rawnsley in the Observer on Sunday. I don't know if anyone read that. I thought there was a lot of sense talked there. We've come to endow polls probably because there hasn't been a spectacular miss since '92 with rather a higher level of precision than they want or even would claim. So we need to think about the Will Jennings chart of the errors on the shares and the leads every time we're approaching an election. And we'll also be thinking about some other ways, not just how the pollsters collect their data, but how other data is collected. The British election study might include a pre-election random wave and so on, and that there are other ideas that we've had about future data collection. But just to finish up by saying I think that unfortunately there isn't likely to be any kind of silver bullet that is going to cure all of these problems forevermore. The risk of a polling miss I think is lower. Probably that's much more to do with Jeremy Corbyn than it is to do with me and my inquiry. But they're much more likely to get it right next time. But the risk of a polling miss is never going to be removed entirely. I mean, I think I do expect, I know that the pollsters will focus on the way they're doing things in a way that they might not have done if they'd have got it just right. So I think things will improve, but we will never remove the risk of being wrong.